Welcome to the Creative Life Podcast. My name is Caroline and I am your host. Today on the podcast, I am absolutely thrilled to have an extraordinary thinker, academic, creator, and fantastic person on the podcast today, Virgil Wong. Virgil is a very accomplished visual artist and digital technologist. His fascinating work has found him at the intersection of art and medicine and artificial intelligence and virtual reality. He also is a distinguished professor at the New School in New York City in the areas of AI, VR, digital design, photography, and interactive media. And he somehow found time in his incredibly busy schedule to spend an hour with me to talk on today's podcast. I'm thrilled to have him on, also because I've always wondered a little bit, hey, Virgil, what is it that you do? Because it's so different than what many, many other artists and creatives that I know do. And so I'm thrilled that he's here to tell his own story in his own words. And I know that you're going to find it just as fascinating as I did. So without further ado, here is Virgil Wong. Virgil, thank you so much for chatting with us today. And I'm really excited to have you here and hear your thoughts on this, on creativity and all of this in your work. Would you kick it off and just describe a little bit about what you do? How would you describe yourself?
Dr. Moore, it's so great to connect with you and have this wonderful conversation. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'm a visual artist who uses digital technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, as well as traditional media like painting and drawing. And the purpose is to study healthcare, human anatomy, human mortality these days. I've been teaching virtual reality, photography, film, interactive media at the New School for, 24 years now. It's been a while.
Wow.
And of course, we have our shared academic connection at Columbia University Teachers College.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the PhD Cognitive Studies and Education program, focusing on intelligent technologies. So around that time, I founded Medical Avatar, an AI VR digital health company. And I currently work as the healthcare managing partner of the world's leading technology research and consulting firm.
Oh my. So you're very busy.
I like to stay busy.
You're very busy. Has your work at this point led you more into executive administrative kind of world, or are you still really hands-on with the tech and the creative side?
I've been fortunate to have a bit of both. I think that balance is very important, that oftentimes when you're in that administrative managerial role, you kind of lose sight of some of the nuances of what being kind of more hands-on really helps reveal in terms of day-to-day activities and also bigger picture type items. So I really enjoy being able to see things from this high perspective, as well as getting to some of the nitty-gritty. I like the details, devils in the details, as they say, and those different layers of being macroscopic and microscopic, I find to be very useful perspectives.
And do you have a team? Are you managing a team or working within a team, or are you more independent in these capacities?
It's independent. The team is primarily other managing partners and folks who are pursuing their own opportunities or working individually with clients. But with each client engagement, there are directors, associate directors, subject matter experts that I get to work with. And it's really fantastic to be able to bring that sort of insight into an organization. I think after working for 15 years at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medicine, where we were definitely in our own world, and there's so many great experts that are very much within the organization, to get this broader perspective of what's going on from an industry perspective, from a larger market perspective, things that my current company is able to bring to the forefront is so useful, because you're able to see your work in this larger picture of how the healthcare system overall is really operating and really tackling some key challenges that are really ubiquitous for all of us involved in these processes, technologies, and people who are trying to do the right thing.
And I think this is going to sound like a very layperson thing to say, because I am a layperson in your world. But it seems like the technology moves so fast. And is that fairly accurate with where you are with VR and AI and everything that's happening? Is it exciting to keep up with those challenges? Is it frustrating? Is it driving the business forward? How is that affecting the flow?
Well, I think this is where the topic that we're discussing around creativity is so crucial because the technology moves at such an increasingly rapid rate. If you look at the acceleration of adoption of new technologies, comparing TV and radio, where we're talking about decades, versus AI, which was like days, weeks, getting
Right.
like millions of users, that sort of rapid acceleration is something that's very difficult for people to manage. And if you're working in technologies, that's kind of the nature of the beast. So having that kind of broader perspective, for example, Gardner's hype cycle talks about the range of the kind of inflated set of expectations people have with technologies to the sort of trough of disillusionment where you're like, okay, so a lot of that didn't quite pan out the way we imagined. But the trough of disillusionment, I love that term, is really an area where the work really happens, right? You're able to kind of pull out those pragmatic realities of what will actually make a difference in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, what is going to make people's lives easier, what's going to actually increase efficiency and efficacy of what you're trying to do, especially within the healthcare organization where there are so many problematic systemic issues that we're trying to solve. So I take the acceleration as a good thing, but it's really crucial to have a critical perspective on how to apply the new advancements in a way that makes sense, right? Not every tool is a perfect fit for whatever problem you're trying to solve.
Sure. I'm sure there are a lot of bells and whistles and distractions that keep you off task with all of these things.
Absolutely.
And finding out what's useful and meaningful and efficient as well. I mean, there's the efficiency component. I can imagine that there's been processes you've been able to eliminate because of technology that you can focus on other things now.
Absolutely. And I think that's really the goal with AI is not necessarily replacing human talent. I hope that's not a concrete goal, although you might hear differently from different organizations, but really is about the hybrid, is leveraging human talent to think of AI as a creative tool to really drive forward things that may be difficult or may take you longer to kind of process. Sometimes that length of time is necessary and as part of the process to kind of understand what's happening and to address it in some way that is more meaningful than superficial Band-Aids on the wound. Looking at things from a more holistic perspective, I think AI can really offer some really unique ways of delving into a problem that would have been more challenging beforehand. And I think that's really where the focus should be. That level of discernment is something that's really crucial. And the creative use of AI, as opposed to just using it kind of in a more straightforward manner, where sort of you're thinking of it as replacing things that are perhaps irreplaceable. I think that's the kind of the wrong tactic. And this kind of goes back to our conversation around what it really means to adopt a creative practice, a creative approach to the way that you solve problems.
I'd love to know a little more about your path to this point, your story, and how did you go from art into healthcare? Was that a natural extension of what you were doing? Was healthcare always an interest, or is it something that found you along the way?
Yeah, I think there are kind of three guides that kind of put me on this path. And I see art, healthcare, art and science to be very synonymous, to be kind of different sides of the same coin in some ways, or in some cases, the same sides of the same coin. I would say there's probably 3 points or 3 guides that kind of brought me to this point in my life. First, my mother is a visual artist. So she was my very first art teacher. And when I would make watercolor paintings outside, she would encourage me to look closely at the patterns of the leaves or how the filigree of branches would sort of grow together. And she taught me to paint not just what I thought a tree looked like, but to use my eyes and all my senses to really fuel what I imagined in my head. So it really was a synthesis of those two things. And that secondly led me to art school at RISD, where I was primarily a figurative painter, drawer who focused on realism. I see that as more of a limit of my own imagination at the time, but I like to kind of represent what I saw, and hopefully I'm kind of breaking a bit out of that over the last few decades. So I learned things like color theory and Renaissance painting techniques, all the things that I felt made me a legitimate artist at the time. But what really changed everything was studying human anatomy. So I spent a year dissecting cadavers and seeing and understanding the body from the inside out. And that's what really led me to my interest in medicine and working in healthcare and new technologies for the last 28 years.
Forgive me, it just sounds a little bit like, how does one get to just dissect cadavers for a year? Because it's like you were in art school in RISD and then you spent a year. I mean, it sounds so cool, but I'm wondering how that happened.
Well, for anyone listening who might be going to RISD or has a kid or a relative who is matriculating there, RISD has a great collaborative relationship with Brown University. And so there is a class that RISD students, or I think RISD students can actually get a dual degree at Brown and take classes like human dissection. But I had the good fortune of being part of the European Honors Program. So for a year, they shipped it off to Rome for a full year. And the first semester, I was doing what I thought you should do as an art student in Rome, like going to all the sites and sitting in the Pantheon and drawing architecture and focusing on that area. But I was still doing a lot of figurative painting at the time. And I realized, you look at art history, whether it's Da Vinci, Carracci, any of these artists, Michelangelo, Jericho, would look at cadavers as a way, and human anatomy as a way to bring their human figures to life, that you really couldn't represent the human body without knowing it from the inside out. So I said, okay, well, if that's the secret, that's the trick, then I'm going to study human anatomy. And I just pulled together my portfolio and dropped it off at the University of Rome Medical School to the Anatomy Institute. And the director, Professori Barberini, was who I found, through my research. Left a letter for him that I tried to write in Italian, which was probably pretty terrible Italian, and said, I would love to, I'm an art student, I would love to learn human anatomy. Here's some of my work. If you're interested, please give me a call. The next morning at the studio, Professor Barberini shows up. He's like, Dove Virgilio? Who is this Virgilio? I kind of raised my hand, and he absconds with me. And the next thing I knew, I was in a freezer with dead bodies all around me. And he pulls out a gurney and hands me a cleaver and says, okay, Virgilio, you put the incision, cut the head right through here, the chest. And
is this your first dead body? Or I would be so excited. So exciting, but so terrifying at the same time.
I specifically did not go into medicine because I didn't want to deal with the blood and guts and all that. And and suddenly I found myself confronted with all of that. So this was my first dead body. So while all the other students were still off, drawing architecture and doing things you're supposed to do as an art student in Rome, I was cutting up dead Italians and learning about human anatomy. And it was pretty horrifying, I have to say. My initial revulsion, there was nothing that really kind of prepared me for this. As you know, my husband, Ian, loves horror movies, but I do not. So this was not something that appealed to me at any level aside from this kind of academic interest. But what happened that I thought was really interesting was that once I got over that revulsion, I started getting very interested in the intricacies of the body. And, initially from more of a visual layer, right? Just saying, when you see the cluster of nerves and blood vessels in the body, it looked like the filigree of branches and trees and things like that. I started to kind of see those connections that there really was. It felt like excavating this entire civilization. Once you kind of open up the chest and you saw all the tissues, organs, and cells all within our anatomy and our physiologies. And it really got me thinking about my own mortality. It got me thinking about a lot of what I later learned to be Cartesian theory about our body and spirit and things of that nature. And it really kind of opened up my thinking in terms of who we are in the world, how we should approach the way that we think and learn about ourselves and the world around us. So to me, that was really a transformative moment. And I saw this pursuit in healthcare to be a channel, a way to kind of further explore those interests.
Yeah, so it kind of sounds like it all came together at that point where you started to see the applications for the work you had been doing in this new way. Were there other people doing that kind of work in healthcare at that time, or were you kind of out there on your own?
Yeah, I felt like there's definitely a certain level of disconnect when I would tell my colleagues at the hospital that, I have an art show coming up and there's some human anatomy related stuff, there's some human mortality related stuff. And they're like, okay, well, that's interesting. And they would ask, do you make a lot of money from your artwork? And I was like, well, no, actually, that's why I work here. And whatever resources I have goes into the paintings and installations and things that I've been creating. And they would invariably ask, well, why do you do it? What's the purpose of it? And I would find myself in a position to try to explain or justify something in this way. And I don't think it necessarily had a deleterious impact on my work, but it actually gave me an opportunity to think of different ways to apply some of the approaches that I've been developing to the work that these researchers and clinicians were doing. For example, some of my art projects became kind of offshoots. And I was really interested in taking some of the research that was going on. For example, Dr. David Silversweig, who was the first person to visualize schizophrenia in the brain. I mean, just visually see the activation and the hemodynamic blood flow that happens when somebody is having a hallucination. I mean, to actually see that, I think is just so remarkable. And I was interested in creating these projects to kind of perhaps visualize how this research could be applied in terms of diagnosing patients and creating this sort of fictitious hospital of the future where these sorts of imaginary diagnoses, at least for today, could take place. And that led to projects like my male pregnancy project, or a project called GenoChoice, where you can ostensibly scan your DNA on your computer and create your own genetically healthy child online and really rewrite their genome to increase the possibility, the disposition of characteristics that you found to be favorable. So there's obviously a bit of a social commentary about desired traits and eugenics and all that kind of built into it. But all of that kind of came from what I thought was really interesting research work, analysis that I think could be filtered through the lens of more creative pursuits to look at things in different ways. One of my favorite books still is by E.O. Wilson, called Consilience. I don't know if you come across that. Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. And there's some problematic aspects of the book, but I really love the way that E.O. Wilson talks about how any particular problem or topic isn't necessarily limited to a certain discipline. If you're talking about the climate crisis, it's not just a science problem, it's not just a political issue, it's not just an economic issue, it's all those things together. So if you're a specialist in one of those areas, you're seeing a somewhat distorted view of the bigger picture. And if you can take a more conciliant approach, meaning that you're kind of looking at all these different fields and trying to solve a problem from this holistic perspective, then you're more likely to come up with more viable solutions. And so I find that to be a very interesting approach, and something that I think creativity, the arts, the sciences, those are opportunities for us to really work together, take these different areas of expertise and tackle a problem in some sort of novel way.
Yeah. And if you're making me think, of course, of traditional education, which is my professional background, and just how siloed, that's the word everybody always uses, siloed, all of the disciplines have become. Everyone focused on their line, their end game of what they're doing in their class and their discipline. And there's not a lot of consilience, in my view, in traditional educational, formal education. Do you feel like you had that kind of a background in your education, or did you have more of a, what I would say, traditional education growing up?
Yeah, I would say my education was probably more on the traditional side, but I think there were a lot of seeds for consilience that were kind of planted. I grew up in a very small southwestern town in Virginia, Blacksburg, Virginia, which has a great fortune of having Virginia Tech, a world-class university, right there in the town. So that academic influence, I think, really has a positive influence on all the kids growing up. It definitely had a big impact on me. So to be able to kind of see how these fields converge together, their tagline is, innovate or kind of building the future. And that sort of focus is something that I believe very strongly in. I think one of the key opportunities for consilience that I see, that I feel is very much rooted in this background, is as you start going into some of these healthcare issues and you look at things like patient-physician communication. And when a physician asks you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? And my response is always like, well, 1 to 10, what? And what does that even mean? Like, it sounds very precise and scientific, like, it's a 4.5. But like, that's, as you know, as an academic and researcher, right? That's not really a valid or reliable way of measuring something that's unmeasurable. Yes. And so one book that kind of I feel is so connected to consilience is Elaine Scarry's The Body and Pain. The Making and Unmaking the World. It came out like, I think, late 70s. And she talks about how medicine and science is really not well equipped to describe phenomena like pain, right? You can't measure it. It's hard. It's something that's hard not to feel in your own body. And it's really hard to feel in somebody else's body, right? You really have to listen and empathize to kind of connect and understand that pain. And what does come through is the arts and literature as a way of describing pain. So to be able to kind of hear that story, engage with it, that's such a more powerful way of understanding pain in somebody than just hearing that it's a 4.5 on this kind of imaginary pain scale. So there are very concrete opportunities like that for arts and creativity to have a profound impact on the way that we manage and administer medicine, the way that we engage with patients, the way that we are able to better serve our communities and deliver the work that we're responsible for.
Yeah. What would you say are the most creative aspects of your work and your please don't share any proprietary knowledge with us. Certainly not. But just are there aspects that you find to be particularly creatively challenging and stimulating?
Yeah, I would say that there are certain points of interactions. Like listening to me is a great way to draw and fuel my creativity. I think the more open I am, the more creative I am, right? Which sounds kind of counter to it, right? You think of being creative, like, oh, I'm producing all this kind of great stuff, but that really comes from being able to have this sort of intake and openness. And if you know Pauline Oliveros, who talks about kind of deep listening, I love that concept, and also kind of being open to the unexpected. So with my medical startup, I was interviewing hospital patients for a data visualization app that I had created, and I'd met multiple people who had these near-death experiences. So I'm just asking them about their symptoms related to whatever condition that they're dealing with, and they're like, oh yeah, and then when I went to cardiac arrest, I was floating above the hospital, the surgery table, and I could see my body, and I could see what the surgeon was doing, and I'm thinking, wow, this is hallucination or whatever. But the patients would describe it as, this is, when you wake up from a dream, it's a dream. But from this experience, it felt as vivid and more real than me speaking to you right now. And I can't explain it, but that is what I experienced. And so that feeling of your consciousness leaving your body, the light at the tunnel, this life review where it's not just like dream images, but you're reliving these key moments in your life where you learn something quite profound, or you are learning by going through this experience and hearing the thoughts of other people, and not just recalling a memory, but going back to that moment and realizing, oh, this is the impact I had on this other person, good or bad, and having a real learning experience from this near-death experience that has occurred. Mm-hmm. And it's really profound. If you look into research, I think some studies have shown up to 15% of people who survive a heart attack or similar traumatic event have reported an NDE. And I find this sort of research
really? that many. I find that to be, I didn't know that, and that's really quite a lot.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that alignment. The patients I was working with were folks in cardiology and cardiac surgery. So most of the folks I talked to had a cardiac arrest. So there was a very large number of people that I directly encountered. Mm-hmm. So these NDE stories, the research itself, I find to be an endlessly inspiring source of creativity.
That's really, you've given me a lot to think about there. That's really interesting. I'm curious also, what do you think the art world thought of your diversion into healthcare? Like your art colleagues, because you were doing, traditional art studies, if you will, visual art and painting and then made this diversion. Did you feel like when you were sharing your work, your artwork, that the art world received it with the same curiosity and openness that the medical world did, or what was their reaction?
I would say not particularly welcoming or interested. I would say, there's certainly quite a few artists like Damien Hirst that kind of draws upon like healthcare and science in their work. But I think in terms of what I exhibited in my 20s and 30s, anything that was sort of anatomical related, people were seen as like, oh, it seems very kind of backwards, or stuff that you'll never paint as brilliantly as any of these kind of masters that you're sort of referencing in your work. So I think that was kind of interesting. And then when I started delving more into some of the visualization or technology pieces of it as well, I don't know if I quite found that sort of connection with folks that share that same sort of interest, this sort of multidisciplinary approach. I think a lot of the artists felt that the work was very science-based, and a lot of the scientists felt that the work was too artsy and not of interest to them. There was this great art and science event in Prague, I think back in late 90s, that brought together many of these artists and scientists working in these fields. And that sort of gap kind of definitely existed, right? So we have Edward Cack, who was like, oh, hey, I can make this bunny fluorescent green by altering their genes, and like, oh, look how cool that is. And scientists are like, well, that's not really interesting from a research perspective. Like, that's helpful perhaps for some of the tools and work that we're doing, but we don't see any kind of novelty or interest in that per se. So I think finding that alignment and around these kind of core problems and taking that Consilience approach, to me, is something that's far more interesting than being successful purely in one of these areas of study.
Yeah, I do feel like scientists, to me, are characterized by curiosity in my mind. Like there's a common sort of respect and understanding of and gravitas placed around curiosity. And I wonder, as an arts educator, I have felt, in my opinion, that there isn't necessarily the same focus on curiosity, I would say, in the traditional sort of art education lines, that it is, in my view, focused a lot more on skills-based and achievement of skills, but not necessarily, like one might think, about asking those questions of what if, and what is the next step here, and how could I, find consilience, like you were saying, and how can these things join, or what can I do that's never been achieved before, or has not been looked at in this way. That I find some resistance to that in the traditional art world, if you will. So I think it's interesting how we just assume that art will be open to whatever. I think a lot of people listening to you might be surprised to hear that the artists weren't just like, hey man, that's great. Like when you started doing something different, that they were a little resistant. But I have to say, I'm not so surprised, because that's been a bit of my experience as well, in that world. But okay, so now in your life now, you're a very, very busy person with a lot on your plate. Do you find any time outside of work to do creative things, other things?
Yeah, I think it really is important to kind of find that opportunity. I mean, I think everyone will say they're busy, right? It's about prioritizing those things that have a meaningful impact on you. And I think anything that you can do to advance your learning and your connection to other people, and to explore things above and beyond just paying the bills and dealing with all the kind of prosaic activities that we all have to do day to day is so important. My technology consulting work right now for health systems, payers, life science companies definitely occupies most of my cognitive energy week to week. But I do sketch, draw, paint, write every day. I see this as not just a creative process, but more about kind of thinking through and processing, right? So without it, things just kind of get clogged up, and I'm just not kind of able to function as well as I would otherwise. And inspired by those near-death experiences, I've been developing creative projects like this near-death experience in VR. So trying to recreate some of the stories I've been hearing from patients. And the goal is to really promote healthier views about life and mortality, right? If this possibility exists that these experiences are happening for so many people, then maybe there's something to it. And there's certainly a spiritual dimension to it, but maybe a way of really looking at your life and developing more positive attitudes, including adopting creativity into your day-to-day life.
Wow. So so that sounds like you're working when you're not working.
That's how you define work, right? So, I mean,
no, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, do you feel that your work is work, or is it stimulating and so satisfying that it feels like play?
I would probably prefer to describe it as play, even though that gets trivialized as, oh, that's like a hobby or whatever. But there definitely is a level of engagement that could qualify it as work. I think the big distinction is to really focus on what you're gaining from it. So yes, it's work taking extra classes or pursuing some sort of activity. But if you find that rewarding, then that's super helpful. And think of things that people traditionally frame as relaxing, right? Watching TV, there's actually a lot of maybe not super well, maybe some learning. There's a lot of research we came to across at Columbia saying, watch, maybe TV is actually making you smarter, that you have these very complex plots and characters that you have to kind of follow through episode to episode in order to kind of keep that narrative cohesive. But it can also be very taxing, right? If you watch TV for 4 hours and the Netflix thing keeps popping up saying, "Oh, do you want to continue?" And and you do, and you watch Netflix for 6 hours, you're probably really tired afterwards. So you can spend the 6 hours, watching that. And there's a lot of great television, don't get me wrong, but that same amount of time can be invested in other areas that you might actually find more rewarding than kind of watching TV for that time.
Well, there's a joy component, I feel like, in what you're saying, is that too, that things could be work, but if there's joy in it, then you create a different feeling of what it feels like to be in it. I mean, to me, that's when it starts to feel like what I would call flow, like being in flow when you're so immersed in something. I feel like to me, there has to be an element of joy in order to achieve flow.
Yeah.
And feel that you're really immersed in something and you don't even realize the time is passing because you're so, Does that happen for you? Do you have that feeling?
It does. I think kind of focusing and allowing yourself to fall into that flow is so important. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people are attracted to kind of like watching movies or kind of being stuck to the screen in that sort of fashion. But what happens is that now people are like looking at their phones while like watching something on their screens and doing something else at the same time. And I like to think of flow as simply staying focused on a single task. And I know you're familiar with all the research suggesting that multitasking is actually task switching, right? So the brain can't focus on more than one complex task at a time.
You really can't multitask. That's not true. So,
yeah, everyone thinks they can.
Multitasking is not a thing.
It's not a thing, but everyone believes that. Oh, I'm a really good multitasker. I'm like, probably not. So we tend to be overconfident about our ability to switch tasks, which is what multitasking is, right? So the cognitive cost, attention residue. I love the kind of description on that, right? So you're losing your focus, slower performance, more errors when you're switching between tasks, which is what you're actually doing. So it's far more effective to just complete one task and then move on. So I really focus on removing distractions and really immersing myself in the task at hand. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to really kind of find concrete activities to kind of help you get into the flow. I think having a dedicated space for creative tasks is very important, whatever that might be, and whatever limited space you might have. My PhD research at Columbia centered on embodied cognition, that theory that our thoughts, emotions, and understanding about things are shaped by our physical bodily experiences, interactions with the environment, things like that. So when I'm in the flow, I really like to sketch, draw, write, cover a wall with Post-it notes. Those are things I consider to be very kind of fun and playful.
And they also make other people think, gosh, he's so smart. When they see a wall full of Post-it notes, it's that beautiful mind picture, and you've connected them with yarn and all this kind of stuff. No.
or a psychotic person, right? Or the like serial killer.
Trying to solve a murder on your wall and you've got it all connected. If I can just have one more piece, I'll put it together. Yeah. Oh, I love that kind of thing. No, yeah. It's hard to, I find so much energy goes into like you were saying, the cognitive tasks of work and life and all of that. It is hard to achieve enough space, I find, in my daily life to achieve kind of a flow state as often as I would like, because it does take some space and time, and the environment needs to be conducive to it, and the sound and where you are and all of these pieces, like you're saying. And I love that. I mean, I personally love it. When it happens, it's like, it's just the best. But yeah.
Well, I feel like what you're doing now with this podcast, you're creating a structure and a way to open yourself up to be flow. Like, right now we're focused exclusively on this conversation.
I'm trying. I set the kids away. The kids are gone, and nobody's in the house. But you, exactly. Well, you try, because there's something about digging in deep to something, and to me, that is very creative when you dig into something deep, no matter what it is. And maybe there necessarily isn't even an end goal that you're hoping to achieve, but it's just the digging in is what you're hoping to achieve. And then also that feeling of when you have a really long-term task, and you're set about achieving something that's very long-term, which, something like, as a musician, if I was trying to master a very difficult piece that I knew would take me consistent sessions of flow over a long period of time to achieve that, what some people call in educational circles grit, that term that gets thrown around all the time. that is optimal in some ways to me, in terms of if you can achieve that and be able to look out that far in the distance and continue to put yourself into these states that are conducive to achieving that goal. Gosh, just think of what we could accomplish. I've just basically said why I can't seem to learn how to play Rhapsody in Blue. That's pretty much just summed it up, because I don't have the grit for that task.
Well, I think one thing that is often recommended by cognitive psychologists and such is really breaking those longer term goals into very specific objectives that could be very process oriented. So if you're like, oh, I want to play Rhapsody in Blue, yes, that's something that is doable, right? But that's kind of not something you're going to learn today. But maybe for today, like I'm going to learn the right hand of like the first measure and play that perfectly, and start really slow, and then maybe speed it up tomorrow and play it just as well without any mistakes at a slightly faster tempo. And so kind of breaking down those tasks can be really helpful to think about. And also just trying to embrace the process. Like I tend to be very outcomes oriented. You know, the professional work I do is very outcome based, or you have to show the business value and you have to really quantify what you're doing and how you're doing and how well you're doing. But for me, outside of that, the pleasure is just saying, hey, I was able to spend 30 minutes trying to play this piece of music that I never thought I could play. And I mastered that one measure in one hand. And that's pleasurable, right? That process has to be pleasurable. And until you can kind of embrace that, the fixation on concrete goals can actually be a deterrent. And I think that's something that I would encourage people to try to set aside and embrace kind of that moment. And that kind of ties in with that sort of kind of consciousness, awareness of embracing of your present and being present in that present moment. And that's hard for a lot of us to do, given the culture that we live in.
Absolutely. It's the thinking about you can't forget about the long term if that's what your goal is, but just thinking, okay, what am I trying to accomplish today? That's pretty much what teaching is. I mean, that's what great teaching is having those long-term goals for your students and then breaking it down into the shorter units and trying to just get them to focus on the shorter unit for one day and moving them forward. That's a wonderful way to be. You have a great way of looking at it. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about your childhood. I think it's really fascinating that your mother was an artist. I did not know that. And I think that's just so interesting. Do you feel like did you grow up in an artful household in the sense of there were materials around that you could use freely? And was this sort of a regular part of your childhood at home, making things and exploring in that way?
I think a lot that kind of came out of necessity. I mean, I have an older brother who is interested in technology and computers and things like that as well. But certainly early on in my childhood and my parents' lives, we were somewhat resource constrained. My mom talks about having to barter her educational skills, like tutoring kids of like the butcher at the grocery store in exchange for food to be able to feed the family. So there's certainly limitations that we're facing on that front. But I think having those constraints actually help from a creative standpoint. So instead of getting like the latest toys, I would get like paper to draw on and things of that nature. And I appreciated that. My father is also a history professor, so our home was filled with books. So we may not have been able to afford food, but we needed to fuel my dad's research and work on that front. So there's certainly a balance on that. But having access to that knowledge was really quite remarkable. I just loved having the Encyclopedia Britannica at my fingertips, and much of the material was kind of beyond me. But I do remember some kind of key pieces of text that really were kind of inspiring me, and to have that available was just really so unique. And that knowledge and the people too, right? We tend to think of resources as purely, having the best art schools or these programs and all these things, which is absolutely crucial. But I remember my childhood best friend's mother, Betty Moore, is an artist, and alongside my mom was an art teacher for me. And I remember very specific things like her explaining how even the most subtle shift in expression or movement changes everything about the face or the figure of the person that you're painting. My high school teachers at the public high school had great art teachers, right, above and beyond what you might expect. Robin Scully Boucher and Linda Henson were both incredible educators who really changed my life. Linda taught me how to observe very meticulously, right? And hone my craft drawing. So there was a craft component to it, but kind of looking beyond that as well. I think that was also a big part of her teaching. Robin Scully opened up endless creative channels for me, including having me start my first dream journal sketchbook. So when you talk about looking for sources of creativity, it's all in your head. It's all right there. You just have to tap into it. So just waking up in the middle of the night or in the morning, jotting down some notes or doing some quick drawings, that's something that I love to do. And it actually has helped me on multiple fronts, even from a health perspective, where I feel like going to bed at night, that's kind of setting the stage for creative work the next day, not just in terms of rest, but that, hey, I know in this world, this culture where we're so focused on productivity, it's like, oh, I'm being productive in my sleep on some level. Probably not the right way to think about it, but it keeps me from staying up all night working on something, trying to be productive or getting something done. It's like, no, I need to rest for my health. And there's also something that will inspire me, hopefully, or have something that I can draw from the next day.
So you had some very key formative, I think, teachers that really gave you space to think creatively and encouraged you to make some of your own creative decisions, it sounds like, from an early age. And I think that's very unique and special. I mean, to oversimplify that, it's special in the sense of, I haven't had many people say that to me on this podcast. I've had a lot of people say that they did not have the opportunity to think creatively, make their own decisions until after they were out of school. So I think you had a special experience.
Oh, I'm very grateful for that. And I feel so fortunate to have both these people as formal teachers. And I think, like many of your other podcast guests, to have encountered people who were mentors, who were teachers outside of this kind of formal educational format. Some of the most amazing artists that I've worked with are also teachers and have taught classes. There's an organization called Morbid Anatomy that has really inspired me in recent years. The founder, Joanna Ebenstein, just wrote a book. Oh, I think I have it here. Memento Mori, The Art of Contemplating Death to Live a Better Life.
Oh, wow. And what a beautiful book that is. Just visually so stunning.
Yeah. And if you think what necessity is the mother of invention, right? Constraints are what kind of drives creativity. I think that's an interesting concept. Well, the limited time we have on this earth should be a very strong driver for not just being creative, but living your life to the fullest. And this book that she wrote is really built upon her many years, decades leading this organization, bringing out classes, creating these events where people are exploring the questions around death and ways that people have looked at it, both from a religious, spiritual perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a scientific perspective. There are a lot of clinicians, researchers involved in the organization. She's written this step-by-step guide to accepting and embracing your mortality as a way to live that more fulfilling life. And there's some really wonderful practices and approaches and thinking that she's embodied in this book that just came out.
Which fantastic. I'll have to get that.
Incredibly inspiring. It's also kind of made me think about ways that we can cultivate creativity in so many different ways. So especially as an educator, I think it's important to think of everyone as having this remarkable creative potential and to have our responsibility as educators to cultivate that creativity. I mean, to slightly modify Picasso's famous quote, right? Every child is creative. The problem is how to remain creative once we grow up. Mm-hmm. So I know you're aware of the studies showing that if you tell teachers that they're working with gifted kids, they're far more likely to perform successfully than an equivalent group of kids with the same teachers who are told that the kids are average or underperforming, right? That perception is so important. Self-perception or perception of your students. So I like to think of all my students as having unlimited creative potential because they probably do. I think they do. So the first step for me is really to encourage students to unburden themselves of any self-perception limitations. I'm not concerned if you don't draw, sing, play music, dance, make videos, write poetry, all those kind of things that people tend to think of as creative activities exclusively. For my graduate students, I'm not concerned if you've been a data entry clerk for 20 years and don't think of yourself as an artist. That's perfectly fine. We're going to do creative stuff together. We're going to go on a journey together to look deeply into a topic, hopefully something that you feel passionate about, learn everything we can about it, explore new possibilities with this knowledge, and generate creative responses based on how this information resonates with you. And I'd like to think of maybe kind of a 3-peer framework for fostering creativity for teachers. I like to think about encouraging this kind of exploration. So I think we should really create a safe space for curiosity exploration, as you mentioned, open-ended inquiries, right? Open-ended being the very operative word here that we tend to forget because we have a very strict curriculum sometimes that we have to cover. We have to cultivate this growth mindset. So it is learning from specific tasks, but also encouraging making those mistakes, right? Learning from those specific actions and how they pan out and seeing how that kind of plays out in a much more organic environment than what you might typically see in many classrooms. And I would say third, we really have to provide this kind of structured freedom, which kind of sounds, like an oxymoron, but it's not, right? You're offering a framework for learning, but you're leaving that room for independent problem solving. And to me, that's really where the magic happens. The structure is so important. People, again, think of fostering creativity as removing obstacles, right? But constraints are exactly what drives creative professionals. I like to think of digital designers, developers that I've been working with for many years now. We depend on detailed functional, non-functional requirements to create a website or an application. Likewise, I think as an artist, I always think of, and I showed this film in my classes, called The Five Obstructions that came out in 2003. Jorgen Leth remakes one of his short films 5 times based on obstacles conceived by Lars von Trier, who a lot of people know as the enfant terrible of filmmaking, and he kind of shows that in this film. But in each remaking, we see that these obstructions are actually gifts that inspire Jorgen Leth to make some astonishing creative choices, like this gorgeously rhythmic stop motion version when he's required to make a cut every few seconds, right? It sounds destructive, but he actually creates something really beautiful that wouldn't have come out otherwise. And it's when Lars von Trier removes all the obstructions, he's like, yeah, fine, do whatever you want. The resulting film is kind of tepid and less interesting. So I find that remarkably interesting for how we should think about cultivating creativity in our classrooms.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick note in the middle of today's episode to let you know that we are currently setting up season 2 of the Creative Life podcast, and we are looking to interview creatives of all definitions of creative. So if you're a creative professional or a passionate amateur or a hobbyist or what I like to call a dabbler in any walk of life, please visit our website if you're interested in being one of our interviewees. It's arts-collab.com/creativelifepod. Visit our website and let us know. Back to the episode.
When you are working with students, is there something, I'm sure you see the ones who come very easily to creativity, who kind of have it a little more part of their nature. Is there something that you see that they have in common, some sort of experience that they share that potentially makes that an easier transition for them? Or the ones who have a more difficult time making creative decisions and moving into it, is there something you see that they have in common?
I would say that kind of common characteristic over the years is really, again, this kind of self-limiting belief that it's something where they were told that, oh, that was the wrong answer because it kind of felt interesting or exciting to them. That's why I always kind of hate these kind of multiple choice examinations or, when you take the kind of standardized tests. I always kind of think of more like, well, this answer could be correct if you frame it in this context in this way. And of course, that's not what they're asking for in these types of assessments. So I think there is this kind of conditioning that a lot of students have to get over to really explore possibilities that they were told were either incorrect or wrong or inappropriate. And there has to be a structured channel for them to be able to explore that and find those connections where this different way of thinking is something that actually can be an advantage and actually will open up new possibilities. That's somewhat difficult balance for many educators to strike, but I think it's important to recognize that and not kind of foster those sort of self-limiting beliefs.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that most students, once they realize that that's the norm that you're trying to establish, do you think that most students are able to jump into that, or do you find resistance because of just these established patterns? I mean, is it, I guess what I'm asking is it difficult to pull creativity out of them, or is it sort of like the dam opens?
I tend to think it's more of the latter, like once you kind of give folks permission to do that And as educators, we're the kind of orchestra conductors, right? We set the framework, we set the boundaries of kind of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. There's so many ways to not just open up the dam, but create those right channels so that the water flows in a way that is exciting and useful and filling those kind of aquifers and whatnot, as opposed to being flooded, flooding, causing destruction and chaos, right?
Washed out.
Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
you don't want to wipe out anything or cause any chaos or confusion for people. But I do find that students do embrace that opportunity to kind of try new things and new approaches. I think there's often a mix of what people tend to think of as creative, like, oh, in my PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to become creative by adding lots of animations and transitions and bells and whistles and things of that sort. Or you can also think about creativity as, hey, what are different ways I can tell the story that's not just 3 bullets and a title and it's the conventional approach to talking about things. So how do you build upon a convention, right? Conventions, I don't necessarily think of as pejorative. It's something that allows us to kind of communicate or have some sort of common ground to work from. But where creativity comes in is to build upon that, to try some novel approach where we can maybe resonate more. We can maybe explore or understand something beyond this kind of surface level approach that those conventions tend to lock us down into.
And I do find that there's a bit of uncomfortableness in that. There can be a bit of fear in that, those first steps forward. I even feel that now with stepping forward into a new creative thing and not knowing what the boundaries are and wondering if you've gone too far. There's a bit of fear in that. And I do think in education, if you, like you're saying, if you create an environment where those steps are valued, whether they were a misstep or a misdirection, or they need to be channeled in another way, is one thing, but where it's still valued as an offering worth having done, that you're creating this environment where they're going to be more likely to take that other risk. They're going to be more likely to take that feedback and then turn and grow and make another trial and make another attempt. So you're establishing that it's okay to be wrong. That it's okay. And in academia, for so many students, especially those who have been really academically successful, they've been trained to be right. They've been like the standardized tests, right? They've been trained to get those answers correct and to perform quickly. And they have won at the game of school. And then they come to you in higher ed. And you may be one of the first teachers that comes to them and says, now, wait a minute, you can take a risk here. You can take a risk here. And if it doesn't go so well, it's not going to be the end of your academic career. And I can imagine for some that's a revelation, or it could be.
I love that. I think so much of our educational system is training our students to be like AI or to be like machines. Like, why are we training people, humans, to think like machines, right? Processing lots of data and regurgitating that data on the fly as rapidly as possible. There's a great book that's really focused on AI and healthcare that talks about how we're really training doctors, expecting doctors to act like machines, right? By like doing data entry when you're in the middle of an appointment and they're like down on their computer typing up stuff from your visit as opposed to looking at you as the patient. Or you're expecting them to know every single clinical trial that's ever come out for this esoteric condition or something that you might be dealing with, right? That's what AI is really good for. So let's get the AI to do that. And let's let the doctors focus on being healers, being physicians, being the caregivers.
Being humans.
Let's become a human. And I think that the same thing is true for students, that we need to find that balance. And really, it's not about, oh, we're not going to share information or expect you to learn specific facts and information that would be useful. I think that obviously is still a part of what we need to teach, but we need to, I think, do a better job of personalizing that information. So how do people kind of take that information and apply it in some way that is either maybe problem oriented or something that is applicable to something that they can relate to. And I think secondly, it's really important to make sure that that sort of personalized resonance is something that can kind of be carried over, right? We all know that, information tends to be very kind of specific, but knowledge is a little bit more generalizable. You can transfer knowledge and certain skill sets into other fields and other functions. And oftentimes it's really hard to see that jump when the information is presented in such a didactic, limited sort of fashion. Absolutely. So there are opportunities for us as educators to be more creative in terms of how we think about information, the content that we're sharing, and what we're expecting people to learn and use from what we're sharing, and how to create a more interactive, personalized approach to make our work more fulfilling and hopefully having a stronger and more powerful impact on our students.
Absolutely. And I do think what you're describing takes a lot of confidence and skill, of course, in the teacher, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of your own continued study and work in order to do that. But also, and it can't be discounted, a supportive institution that values that as well, that really sees that this is an important aspect of how you're reaching the students and the expectations that the students have for the education they're going to receive at the institution. Because I do, there's a lot of frustration amongst teachers from primary school all the way through university, with administrations not understanding what their goals really are and trying to develop these kinds of environments, or doing something a little bit out of the norm, if you will, or off the track. And so I imagine the new school where you're a professor is one, it has a reputation of being one that is open to innovation and really focused on developing critical thinking and creativity in their students. Has that been your perception? If you want to say something negative, I will cut it out so we don't think new school.
Yeah, there's a lot I could vent about, but the new school, at least in terms of my experience, is not necessarily an area where I have too many complaints. I think I've been given a lot of autonomy to shape the classes, to work directly with students. I think the administration, or at least my particular department, has been very good about fostering that creativity in their teachers. The evaluation of teachers is based on student feedback and observations that other faculty come in, like other practitioners, other teachers are kind of seeing what you're doing and getting a sense of your approach to tackling some of the, not just topics that we are kind of assigned responsible by the curriculum to cover, but how we're approaching this, how this applies specifically to the interests and passions of the students that we get to work with. And so that type of student interaction, that focus on working closely with students, is something that I've found to be very, very rewarding. So the flexibility, I feel, is pretty built in terms of the way that the program is set up. And I think what's been really enlightening for me is to really see students who kind of come into the program looking to make a change, and they're really focused on maybe some specific goals. Some cases, students are like, I just want to learn Photoshop. I was like, well, you can learn Photoshop from a YouTube video or several.
That's what I did.
So, yeah. Which is great. That's perfectly fine to kind of learn those skills. But I feel like my responsibility is, sure, let's develop those skill sets, but how are you going to apply that? Can you use Photoshop to paint this kind of picture of this world or the solution that makes sense in your head, but from what I'm hearing from you, I don't quite understand what you're saying, but maybe you can kind of show me. And this is an opportunity to do that, and I'll share with you the skill sets to do that. But let's focus on shaping that concept and thinking through how to approach this and how to develop that idea further. Here are things that maybe you didn't think of that could be a positive influence, or here are things that other people have tried to solve the same problem that you're tackling, and here's kind of what might have worked and what might not have worked, and here's where you can kind of maybe build upon that knowledge to do something new and exciting. So let's not reinvent the wheel, but let's see how different wheels are working and operating, and find a new way and maybe kind of a new destination we can go to together.
The skills are there, but they're just meant to propel you forward into the idea and the truth and what the goal is. And we get very focused on the skills in education, and I get very focused on the skills as an artist. I think I get very focused on the skills, and sometimes we lose track of the fact that no, this is just something somebody invented to help you be able to express an idea. What's the idea? And it's exciting, Virgil. Do you find that your job life and your professor life feed each other, or do you kind of have it separate in your mind, or are there things that come into play, and do they help each other along?
I feel like they're pretty similar in terms of my thinking and approach and attitude about things. Like, I've never wanted to be this didactic teacher teaching from Mount Olympus and imparting my knowledge upon others.
Well, I do. I totally do.
Nothing against that approach.
Kidding, listener. Kidding.
I would like to think of myself as more of a collaborator, right? So just kind of sharing ideas. Here's some things that I find interesting. Let me hear and listen to what you have to share. And to me, that's far more interesting than just sort of taking an approach that is more about like, hey, here's information A, B, and C, points A, B, and C, take that and run with it and do what you want with it. To me, that's missing out on key opportunities to have a dialogue, to kind of take something further beyond where you are today. And without that kind of approach, it's very easy to get kind of locked into those kind of conventions and kind of limited ways of approaching problems and thinking through something that you may want to accomplish that maybe beyond you as an individual, that requires more of this kind of collective brainstorming, collective energy, collective collaboration above and beyond how we typically think of those sorts of teams and ways of tackling problems. So to me, that's a much more fulfilling way of approaching my work life, my teaching life, my day-to-day life than something that is devoid of some of these kind of creative processes that we've been discussing.
I have one last question for you. Do you still play piano? Because I've heard you play piano.
I'm always nervous to play piano or do anything musical related around experts such as yourself or my husband.
Oh, that's a stretch on my end. You mentioned that Virgil is married to a very accomplished musician and music teacher.
Absolutely. So yeah, I could certainly use a lot of help in that department, but I've always found playing the piano, that's something that, referencing my mom again, she always said, oh, I know you're very passionate and you love playing the piano, but just to be frank with you, I don't think you might have the skills or mindset to become a professional musician, which she was right. So I fully accede to that. But she said, as a visual artist in other areas, I would encourage you to kind of explore that. But, don't give up on the music either. So I've tried to hold that close to my heart. I feel now as a 50-something-year-old that when I go back to playing music, I may not have the chops that I did when I was younger. When I go back to a Beethoven sonata that I played for my senior recital, the fingers aren't quite there yet, or quite there as they were. But I feel I bring something more meaningful into playing the music. I feel like I get what the music is about in a way that I just did not comprehend as an 18-year-old, just playing the song maybe musically perfectly or technically perfectly, but maybe musically not quite at the level or depth or meaning that I think a true musician such as yourself or Ian kind of brings to a song or to an interpretation of a piece of music.
But that took me a long time as well. I can't say that I was really thinking deeply about what was going on in the piece when I was 18 or 20 or 25 even years old. And we get there. We all get there. I think there's something to be said for life experience and self-discovery and learning and expanding your mind, and then how that applies to these other things that you do.
I can say like what I love about our interactions and being married to Ian is that this kind of notion of teaching, right? Like I think both of you could have been purely professional musicians, kind of, adorning the stages and doing so much work in that area, but you're interested in really sharing what you've learned, kind of teaching, being a part of this process of constantly learning, to me, ultimately has so much more meaning personally, right? Like nothing against people who are purely focused on performance. That I think that's fantastic. But I really believe in being a teacher, being a mentor to others, sharing what you've learned, and keep that continuous learning going. And for me, art is just this remnant in your heart or your head that you manifest into something that others can see or experience. And creativity, as we're talking about today, is really the fuel for that process. And I think more than ever, we need creativity, we need creative problem solving to address the seemingly intractable issues we're facing environmentally, politically, existentially for many of us. So the focus on creativity that you're exploring right now is so critical, it's so paramount. And for me, creativity is all about understanding, studying, listening, looking deeply into the world as it is, maybe imagining the world as it could be, and bringing that vision to life. So I'm so honored and excited to be part of your journey, looking into creativity, Caroline. And my best wishes and my excitement to be a part of this project is something that I hope will carry through and will continue through all the other conversations that you're having.
Oh, Virgil, thank you so much. And I could not have said it better than you just said it in that last paragraph. So I'm not going to try.
I'm sure you can, actually. So.
No, my friend, you really just summed it up in a beautiful way. I think you can expect a lovely quote on a book jacket one day.
That's a goal. That would be very exciting for me. So
Thank you also for all of the spectacular book recommendations that you mentioned throughout the episode. I've tried to take notes of them, and I'll listen back and notate them all, and I'm going to put them all in the show notes. So
great.
if any of you who are listening are interested in any of Virgil's really spectacular, deep thinking and great recommendations, you will find those in the notes.
Yeah, the artificial intelligence in healthcare book I mentioned is Eric Topol, making can AI make healthcare more human, which I think is a great concept and something that I hope we can all aspire for in that area. So
I hope so too. Thank you, Virgil. Thank you so much,
Caroline. Thank you so much. Good to see you.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Virgil, I can't thank you enough for being on the podcast today. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and ideas, and also for your fantastic reading recommendations. As promised, folks, I will put those into the show notes. And so you can all, as I have, put them onto your list. If you'd like to learn more about what Virgil is up to, you can find some information on our website, arts-collab.com/creativelifepod, or on his website, virgilwong.com. Until next time, keep making stuff.